All right, let's do it.
So welcome back to another installment of the Capital Conversation podcast. Today we're pleased to be joined by Vietnam War veteran, two-term Republican senator from Nebraska, and the 29th Secretary of Defense during the Obama administration, Mr. Chuck Hagel. Secretary Hagel, thank you so much for interviewing with us today.
Thank you.
So getting started, after being discharged from the Army in 1968, you had your first exposure to politics when you were hired in 1971 to work as a staffer for Representative John McAllister, and you eventually rose to become his chief aide, working for him for the entirety of his 3 terms. Can you speak to some of the mentorships and lessons that he was able to provide you?
Well, Congressman McAllister not only taught me much about government and about public service, but probably most importantly, how to be a good public servant. And yes, it's important to do a good job, but it's how you do the job, I think, that's always as important as anything else. And he taught me some valuable lessons in that area. He was a great role model and a good example of what I thought, and still do to this day, someone who really was in public service for the right reasons. And when he thought his party was wrong or he needed to speak up, he did. And so I've always been very grateful to Congressman McAllister for opportunities he gave me and the trust he put in me. Mentors are so important in everybody's life. I mean, everybody needs them. And I think back through my career, I've had mentors at different times in my life that it was really important. If I would not have had those mentors, like Congressman McAllister, I'm not sure what paths I would have taken or if it would have turned out very well.
Shortly after working with Congressman McAllister, you went on to work in the Veterans Administration during the Reagan presidency. To what extent did your experience, serving in the military affect how you viewed your role in the Veterans Administration?
Well, it had a profound effect on my job in the Veterans Administration. I was the number 2 person in the Veterans Administration, the only Vietnam veteran in the Reagan administration. Oh. And it was something very special for me because it was an honor to work on behalf of America's veterans, and many of those were Vietnam veterans. And so what I saw and what I learned and what I experienced in Vietnam carried with me, as it has throughout my life. Judgments I've made in everything, particularly working with veterans, was helped by the fact that I was in the Army and was in Vietnam. I could understand them. It wasn't just empathy, but I understood what they were going through. And that was very important.
When you won your first election to the Senate in 1996, you became the first Republican to win a Senate race in Nebraska in 24 years. And then in your re-election bid, you won 83% of the vote, the largest percentage for any candidate in a statewide race in Nebraska's history. So what qualities about yourself and your campaign allowed you to draw such bipartisan support?
Well, we're all of us a cumulative factor of our experiences in our lives, what we believe, what we think, how we respond, how we act. But I think one of the things that always held me in good stead was I listened. And I think that's a critical component of any job, but especially in public service. You listen. You listen to people you don't agree with. You listen to people who don't agree with you. Everybody has a point of view, and no one has a marking on all the answers or is right all the time. So I think listening was one. I worked hard on behalf of the state, on behalf of the country. I gave others credit for their jobs and what they did to contribute. I tried to always be informed and know what I was talking about, so that every vote I made, you could agree with me or disagree with me, but every vote was predicated on what I thought was solid information, and then judgment. have to always be out with the people too, to get some sense of how they think and what they believe. And that all comes down to judgment. Also, I think in the end, you've always got to do what you think is right. You may be wrong, but I was never conflicted. I was always driven by a North Star. And I think we all need North Stars in our lives. And do what you believe is right. And I use the Constitution as very much a landmark for that. So I think maybe all those things held me in pretty good stead with the people of Nebraska.
You took a lot of heat from the Bush administration for your criticisms of the Iraq War. And in your book, America, Our Next Chapter, you cited the war as one of the 5 biggest mistakes America has ever made as a nation. What do you think President Bush should have done differently to deal with the Iraq War, or do you think we just shouldn't have entered Iraq at all?
Well, first, how we got into the Iraq War was essentially a lie. The Bush administration misrepresented the reasons that we were going to war, and that was that Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, had weapons of mass destruction. He didn't, and that later came out. I never believed he did, and that was based on information that I had from the United Nations inspectors, from some of our own intelligence people. But people in the Bush administration, specifically Vice President Cheney and the National Security Advisor Susan Rice, and particularly Don Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense, wanted to rush us into war. And the President let himself get pushed into a war. It was a terrible mistake. What's going on in Iraq today, it goes right back to our invasion. I mean, when we invaded and occupied Iraq, we set the Middle East on a course of violent destabilization, and it's only gotten worse. Iraq is still a mess today. And based on my experience of going to war and being in a war, reading history, trying to be informed and listen to people, I thought it was a huge mistake. I said so at the time. And I went against my own party and my own president, and I was vilified by my own party. I was called names, and I wasn't a real Republican. I was a traitor to America. I was a rhino, Republican in name only, and all those things. But, you know, I wasn't happy about that, but it didn't bother me in the sense that I was doing what I thought was right. Maybe it showed that I was wrong. I don't think it did, though.
In 2008, when you retired from the Senate after 2 terms that fulfilled a campaign promise that you made in 1996 when you were running your first campaign to retire after 2 terms, I found that a lot of first-time Congress members will make a promise similar to that about term limiting themselves, but it's rarely actually upheld by the Congress member. So can you speak to why you wanted to follow this term limit, or make this term limit promise, and why it was important for you to keep it?
Well, it was a promise I made to the people of Nebraska, and I believe if you were entrusted with their confidence and trust, you don't break those kind of promises. I mean, I probably could have won okay the 3rd term with being reelected with 83% of the vote.
Yeah.
So I probably wouldn't have had any problem. But it was something that I had said I would stand by and I would do, and I wanted to fulfill that. As to the reasons, I think public service jobs, especially, I don't mean career public service jobs as employees in the government. That's different. But elected officials, I think they need to be rotated with new energy and new focus, new thinking. Now, that doesn't mean that some members of the Senate who served 4 terms aren't just as enthusiastic and good and maybe better than they were when they first came in. But for me, it was just the right thing to do. And I remember the night I was elected, 1996. My wife said to me on the stage, and as I was accepting the win, she turned to me and whispered, "Do you think you can keep one job for 6 years?" I'd never had a job for 6 years. And so I said, I'll take and keep this job for 6 years. So it turned out 12. But it was the right thing for me. But I do think you need constant rotation of new energy, new thinking, new ideas, but I think it should be balanced too. I think if somebody wants to serve for 4 terms, they're doing a good job. The people of their state think they're doing a good job. I'm not opposed to that. I wouldn't put term limits on the people, because I think it's up to the voters. If they think their senator or their congressman are doing a good job and they want to keep them, absolutely, it's up to them. But it was the right thing for me.
In 2007, you suggested the Republican Party had been hijacked from its core values, and then entertained running a ticket independent of both parties with Mayor Michael Bloomberg. And then in 2016, you said you would endorse him again as a candidate. How close was that 2008 ticket to running with you and Mayor Bloomberg? And what about him makes you align with him so much politically?
You'll probably edit this out, I hope.
Yes.
Yeah.
Shutting it. I should have shut this thing off. I should have shut it. I'm sorry.
No worries.
Oh, no, you're good.
Okay, give me the question again.
In 2007, you said the Republican Party had been hijacked from its core values, and then considered running as an independent with Michael Bloomberg in 2008. And then in 2016, you also said that if Bloomberg were to run, you would support him.
No, I didn't say that in 2016.
No, you didn't?
That's not true.
What about, or how close was that 2008 ticket to running? And what about Michael Bloomberg makes you align with him so much politically?
Yeah. Well, I did talk with Bloomberg on several occasions about his thinking about a ticket, a Bloomberg Hagel ticket, independent, in 2008. And we looked at it very seriously. But I told him the first time we met, Mike, there's only one question you ask yourself if you're running or intending to run or think you're going to run or might run as an independent for president. What is your pathway to 270 electoral votes? No other question is relevant. And if you realistically don't have a pathway to 270 votes, and that's pretty tough to do for anybody, but especially an independent with neither party behind them, then, and I don't think you should run unless you're in it just to make a statement. I wasn't in it just to make a statement. Yeah. And so he eventually decided that he couldn't do it for the reasons that we discussed. But we had a serious look at it, and he did a lot of polling and other things that led him to that decision. And it was the right decision, and I'm not sure I would have joined if he decided to run. I had told him, I'll talk to you, Mike, let's discuss it. But if he would have actually said, I'm doing it, and I want you to be my running mate, would you run? I hadn't made that decision. As to what attracted me about him, well, first of all, I like Bloomberg. I thought it would have been a difficult run for him to win, not just because an independent to get 270 votes, but a New York mayor, and I mean that's not as good a guy as he is, and as smart, articulate. That's not appealing across the nation position to run from politically. Has said nothing about him personally. I like him. He's smart. He's dedicated, and I like his style. So that's why I entertained the conversations we had.
Do you think that there's room for an independent ticket to have a pathway to 270 votes in today's political climate?
There may well be at some point. And because our country has been so polarized and divided the last 3 years, that may present an opening. It won't be in this election, 2020, but it could present an opening in 2024, where people get fed up with both parties, and they feel the Republican Party is just too far right, Democrats too far left. That's not where America is, by the way. America is center left, center right. We've never elected a real left wing or right wing president. I mean, Obama was liberal, but he was center left. He didn't go that far left. Bush was center right, but he didn't go that far right. And it's not who we are. So it could well happen. Very, very difficult for the reasons we've discussed. with no political party apparatus other than an independent
Yeah.
forum to get to 270 votes. But I wouldn't say impossible for the future. I would say very possible. And I talked about that in my book.
Right,
In
and forming a new
2008.
political party.
Yeah, and I said it's coming. And you're seeing more and more independents, more and more registrations that are independent, registering as independent, not Republican, not Democrat. That's a good sign. But this 3 years, the last 3 years, have been, I've never seen anything like it. It's terribly, terribly divided and polarized. Something is going to come out of that. And so 2024 could be the beginning of a realistic independent run.
So just coming back to 2020 for 1 second.
Yeah.
Do you support Michael Bloomberg's current campaign for president as a Democrat?
Uh,
Or are you involved in the campaign at all?
well, first of all, I'm still a Republican, and whatever that is, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know what a Republican is today. It's not the Republican Party that I joined when I first voted on top of the tank in Vietnam in 1968. But that said, what I think Mike has done is he made a mistake in that you can't get into the Democratic or Republican, I don't think, presidential field when half of the primary is already gone, and you've not participated in any debates, in any town hall meetings. I mean, you haven't done anything other than buy $100 million worth of television. And especially the Democratic Party, where the Democratic Party is not a party that's particularly amenable to billionaire businessmen. And I think Mike's got a big hill to climb, and I just don't think he's going to go anywhere. I mean, the polls don't show anything moving beyond 5 or 6%. I don't think that changes. You've got the front runners who are there, and I think that's probably the 3, 4, 5 is where it's going to be. So I don't think Mike's got much of a chance. However, I would say for the Democratic Party, I think he's doing them a big favor. I mean, in his advertising is $100 million worth of advertising. He's not going after other Democrats.
Right.
He's going after President Trump. And I think that helps Democrats. So I see him making a big contribution to the Democratic Party effort to beat Trump.
So moving on to your time as Secretary of Defense, you were critical of President Obama's decision not to uphold his word on the red line with Syria and authorize the use of military force against the Assad regime for using chemical weapons against their own people, despite the fact that you had missile strikes prepared and ready to launch. So can you talk about how this hurt the United States' position, or you stated that it hurt the United States' position on the world stage in a foreign policy article, and an unnamed administration official responded that Obama was uncomfortable with launching a strike without first having consulted Congress. So when is it appropriate to attain congressional approval for a military strike, and when is it something where the president has to, use the force before actually consulting Congress?
Yeah. Well, I think in this particular case, first of all, it was the president himself who laid a red line out to the world. And he said, if you cross that is my red line. If you cross that red line by using chemical weapons on your people, you'll suffer the consequences, and America will take action. When a president of the United States says that to the world, and says that to your adversary, and your allies are listening too, and you don't comply with that threat, and you don't go forward to meeting that threat, your credibility is severely lessened. With your allies, can we trust whatever you say from here on? And your adversaries who won't believe you. And that's very dangerous when your adversaries don't believe what you're going to do because of past experiences. So that, number one. The entire National Security Council was in favor of hitting Syria
Mhm.
with a missile strike. It wasn't just me, it was the Secretary of State, it was CIA Director, everybody. And then, and that operation was begun.
Mhm.
And the President then at the last minute pulled it back and pulled it down. Now, there is an issue about congressional approval and what is the right authorization. And I'm an advocate of that, by the way.
Yeah.
Of going with the Congress. But in this case, this was a very limited strike that would have had limited impact, very precision, and it was based on, for months that we were giving the President different options where there was not going to be a lot of loss of life, and so on and so on. It would hurt him bad, Assad, but it wouldn't be something that would be overwhelmingly bad for the United States. Now, he's right. The administration official who said that Congress would not authorize that, but that at the time the Congress was controlled by the Republicans.
Mhm. Wasn't authorizing much of what Obama was doing.
Wasn't authorizing hardly anything Obama was doing. And I think at some point then a president has to decide you're going to do this or not on the interest of the country. Now, I believe in the military use of force doctrine that we passed in 2001 and then amended in 2002 to give President Bush authority to do what he did in Afghanistan, and eventually what he took advantage of it in 2002 in going to Iraq.
Right.
So I voted for both, and I think they needed to be updated, and I said so as Secretary of Defense, even when President Obama wasn't that enthusiastic about it. I said, no, we should update this because it's out of date today. So I get that argument, and it's a real argument, and I respect that argument. But there's a way to handle this too. I mean, the Obama administration didn't trust members of Congress keeping anything confidential, and they didn't have a particularly good working relationship, Susan Rice and all of them, with the Congress. They didn't like to work with them. And I often said it doesn't make any difference what you think of John McCain personally. I mean, the fact is that he's a major player and dominant figure in the national security apparatus of the Congress, and you got to have to work with him. It doesn't make any difference what you think of him. That's just the way it works. And so the Obama administration, people in the White House, that is, didn't really take that approach. We could have gone and briefed senior members of the Congress, Republicans and Democrats, on what we were going to do, but they wouldn't do that. And so the decision was made by the President to pull it down. We pulled it down. But I do think it hurt us around the world in our credibility. And another thing it did, it allowed the Russians to come into Syria. The Russians at that time had nothing in Syria. They had a small little base in the Mediterranean at Tartus with a nothing, little couple of boats there. But I mean, they had absolutely no military facilities in the Middle East. They've been shut out of the Middle East over the years. This gave them a new foothold because President Obama's decision backed off on what he had said he was going to do. The Russians came in. The Russians knew we wouldn't do anything about it. And the rest is history.
Also, when you were serving as Secretary of Defense, you were sort of criticized and even mocked both inside and outside the White House for your characterization of the Islamic State as, you know, a rising global threat. And later on, it turned out you were right. I mean, they've been like probably the biggest terror organization we've had recently. In hindsight, what would you say the Obama administration should have done differently to, you know, sort of go along with what you were saying at the time and prevent that?
Well, of course, they should have taken it more seriously. And, you know, I wasn't the only one saying that either. I mean, our generals and others and some of our intelligence people, CIA people, were seeing what I was seeing. But I think President Obama had inherited our two longest wars in history, very unpopular. He inherited the worst economic recession since the Great Depression in the 20s and 30s. And I think he was very much always swayed by not getting us deeper into something. Let's pull us out of these wars. I mean, when I was Secretary of Defense, we brought 60,000 troops home in Afghanistan and closed hundreds and hundreds of bases abroad. And that's generally was Obama's approach to all of this. He didn't want to get us back into a new war or get us further into existing wars. He wanted to get us out of these things. And I think that's what governed a lot of his thinking. I mean, I can understand that. And I appreciate that. So when I come up and say the things I did about ISIS early on, there wasn't a lot of receptivity at the White House. They, Hagel wants us to go after some new group, or what are we going to do? You know, I mean, I understand that. But I mean, there wasn't any doubt in my mind what I was saying was true. And it turned out it was very true, and we're still dealing with ISIS today.
In the early 2000s, you were critical of President Bush's stated intent to keep Guantanamo Bay Prison open permanently, saying that it hurts the nation's image and makes us look like someone that doesn't hold up to our institutions in terms of human rights and right to due process. During your time as Defense Secretary, you were able to transfer 44 detainees, helping to make significant progress towards eventually closing that prison, although it wasn't at a fast enough pace to please the White House, as that had a hand in your resignation. Do you think that we'll ever see a day where Guantanamo Bay Prison is closed?
Well, I hope so. I transferred, I think, maybe more, as Secretary of Defense, more detainees than any Secretary of Defense in Obama's time. What I said in early 2000 for the Senate to close it, I still believe as Secretary of Defense. Now that said, what the Republican House did is they came together with a resolution, which was passed, that we had to live with, that the Secretary of Defense had to sign his name and guarantee that each detainee would be no threat, no further threat to the United States, our citizens, our allies, our soldiers, or anything. The only way I could sign those was that we had to be sure in countries who would take them, how are you going to control those countries? I mean, how are those countries going to control those detainees to ensure they didn't go back to the battlefield, go back to Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, and other terrorist groups? And I would not sign off on a detainee unless I had my Defense Department people go to the country and take a look at facilities that were going to be where the detainees held, how are they going to be held, who was going to be in charge, who was accountable, and make sure that the political people in each country, the president, prime minister, whoever, had signed on that as well. I had to have all those guarantees and have my own people of defense take a look at them first. Is this real or not real? And then I would sign. And I did it in 44 cases. The president wanted me to get it closed down, and I told him in a tense conversation we had one day, Mr. President, I'm not going to just close it down and put detainees out there to go kill Americans again and cause trouble unless I'm as confident as I can be following the mandate of the Congress that I have to sign my name personally on each of these. I'm just not going to do that. And so, and I even said to him, you may need a new Secretary of Defense. I mean, I can't do it in good conscience for this country, and I won't do it. Well, I mean, he then did get another Secretary of Defense after I left, but he let out less than I did, and it never closed. But yes, I would hope that we could close it someday. It was wrong to ever open it up.
So just as a final question, we're running low on time, but You're not a big fan of President Trump. We've seen that from your media
Yeah.
statements or whatever. But can you give us a little more insight into foreign policy in particular, as a former Secretary of Defense, how you view the job he's done so far, and given the latest drone strike in Iran that killed General Soleimani, how's he doing overall, just in terms of foreign policy?
A disaster. The reason I say that, I guess our foreign policy is America first. That's what he talks about all the time. He pushes back, he mocks, castigates all of our allies, questions our alliances, all our trade treaties. He breaks the Iranian 2015 nuclear agreement that all the great powers signed, China and Russia, and our strongest Western allies, Germany, Great Britain, France, NATO, United Nations. What was that about? He pulls us out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. Allies stunned. His closest friends, as he says, are Kim Jong-un of North Korea, the most brutal dictator on the face of the earth, President Xi, and President Putin. Those are his closest friends, he says. He's had no strategy on foreign policy. He's weakened our alliances. Every country where we have troops, and we have bases, and we have alliances, he has pushed them. You're not doing enough. You're not paying enough. You're living off of us. That's what he said about NATO. You all been freeloaders, all these NATO countries. You're going to have to start paying your way. He undoes things in agreements. I don't know what his foreign policy is, but his approach to foreign policy has been an absolute disaster. Our allies can't trust us. They don't know what he's going to do next. Our adversaries are greatly benefited by what he's doing. Putin's been able to maneuver around, take advantage of these relationships, these important Western relationships that President Trump pushes back. The Chinese can do whatever they want, as they have been, because they know President Trump's very unlikely to do anything, because he wants a new trade treaty with them, and he puts tariffs on people. He puts sanctions on people. He puts tariffs on our oldest, strongest allies, on the French, on the Canadians.
Yeah.
Sanctions people. That all adds up to a disastrous foreign policy, whatever that policy is, and I guess it's America first. And that's dangerous in this kind of world. America needs allies. We need alliances. Yes, we're the strongest, most capable country in the world by far, but we're only limited with what we can do with our great power without allies, without alliances, without bases around the world for deployment of our power and our assets. If we didn't have those, we wouldn't be able to project power like the way we do. But we need friends. In a world of 7 billion people that's interconnected in every way, strategically, economically, and security-wise, it's as important as it's ever been in the history of this country that we have strong alliances and allies who know they can count on us.
Well,
that isn't the case today.
Thank you so much, Secretary Hagel, for joining us today and letting us interview you. It means a lot to both of us, and it's going to advance our project a lot, so thank you.
Good.
Until next time, we'll see you on the next installment of the Capital Conversation.
Thank you.